On December 30th, 1997, America's largest grocery chain and at the time the world's largest company Walmart opened its first store in Germany. At the grand opening, a company spokesperson announced this as the first step toward conquering the continent. But just 9 years later, after expanding to 85 stores across Germany, Walmart exited all its European operations. It reported losses of more than $1 billion. This was just one example of countless massive American companies that tried to conquer Europe and failed. Staples tried in 1998, Home Depot in 2001, and even Best Buy in 2010. All of them failed. So what were they doing wrong? After all, they came from the land of capitalism, had massive budgets, and enough experience to crush the competition. Yet almost 9 times out of 10, they failed.
Best Buy is laying off thousands of workers, even though sales there are soaring.
A retail giant is closing stores. Walmart plans to shut down 269 stores.
In 2023, European customers spent more than $9 trillion, making the EU the world's second largest consumer market behind only the United States. To most people, this came as no surprise. After all, just like the US, multiple European countries rank among the wealthiest and most developed on the planet. With similar populations and economies of comparable size, you would be forgiven for thinking Europe and America basically operate the same way. But in many ways, the two blocks could not be further apart. In 2023, about 700 million people lived in Europe, but only around 10% of them had English as an official language. Home to over 40 different languages, Europe is vastly different from the US. While something like language may seem trivial, this difference is just one symptom of something deeper, something that explains why American companies struggle in Europe. In the 1960s, Dutch psychologist Geert Hofstede set out to answer a simple question: why do people from different countries behave so differently? By 1980, that work had become known as Hofstede's Cultural Dimensions, a framework for understanding how culture shapes behavior. It is broken down into 6 key dimensions. One of these dimensions, uncertainty avoidance, measures how comfortable a society is with unpredictability. And this is where things start to go wrong for American retailers. You see, in the US, uncertainty avoidance scores around 46. This means Americans are generally more relaxed about rules, comfortable with experimentation, and fine figuring things out as they go. American companies tend to operate the same way. They test things, pivot quickly, and adapt on the fly. Some European countries like the UK also fall into this category. But move a bit farther east and the picture changes quickly. Countries like Germany score as high as 65, meaning they prefer things clearly defined, standardized, and formal. So when American companies arrive with their well-figure-it-out as we go approach, German consumers often find it unsettling. In 1997, Walmart opened its first store in Germany. Just like in its US locations, all employees received the company handbook. It contained over 100 different rules, but in the culture section there was one rule that took priority over everything else. Whenever a customer comes within 10 feet of you, you must look them in the eye, greet them, and ask how you can help. To Americans, this was considered excellent customer service. But to Germans, with their high uncertainty avoidance scores, shopping at Walmart was a disaster. The friendliness felt fake. The small talk seemed intrusive, and the constant smiling unprofessional. Customers wondered, why is this stranger trying to talk to me? In some cases, this friendliness was even misinterpreted as sexual advances. Instead of building trust, it created discomfort. And finally, after 9 years of poor sales, Walmart had to pull out of Germany. Another of Hofstede's dimensions, long-term orientation, measures how societies balance tradition with change. Here, the US scores relatively low, which means Americans are generally willing to replace old methods with newer, more efficient ones. This is something American companies have always embraced. Countries like the UK and Germany, however, which score much higher, tend to value long-standing traditions, established norms, and gradual change. In other words, they do not switch to new ways just because they are more efficient. And that brings us to Best Buy. In 2010, the American retail giant tried bringing big box stores to the UK. Their pitch bulk shopping. It was far more efficient. In the UK, however, shopping in small quantities had always been the norm. With their tendency to stick with what they already knew, Best Buy felt unnecessary. After years of barely any business, Best Buy had no choice but to pack up and leave. Time and time again, American companies have struggled in Europe, not because their business models were bad, but because they kept trying to sell the American way of doing things to people who simply were not interested. It simply did not work. That did not mean American success in Europe was impossible. Once companies accepted that European consumer culture was fundamentally different, they stopped trying to copy and paste the American model and started building Europe-specific strategies instead, all in an effort to navigate those differences and tap into the continent's vast consumer market. But as they quickly discovered, this was easier said than done, because unlike what they were used to, Europe was not just another market. It was a collection of different values, cultures, and people who just happened to share the same continent. In 1985, Domino's Pizza opened its first store in Europe, located in Bedfordshire, England. Unlike its US locations, which were mostly large restaurants, things in the UK were completely different. Brits did not eat out nearly as often as Americans. So instead of opening large suburban restaurants, Domino's focused on small stores in student-heavy areas that prioritized delivery over dining in. And it worked. By 1999, they had expanded to over 200 stores. In less than a decade, that number had more than doubled. From Domino's perspective, the lesson was clear: they had found a winning model. And for an American company, that meant one thing: scale it. You see, for decades, these companies had been trained to replicate whatever worked and expand aggressively. With a shared language, media, and consumer expectations, the US is more or less a unified market. So a strategy that works in one part of the country will almost always work everywhere else. This is why Walmart can roll out identical stores nationwide, why McDonald's sells the same menu in every state, and why Coca-Cola can run the same marketing campaign from California to Virginia. So when Domino's executives saw their delivery-first strategy take off in the UK, expanding it across Europe did not feel risky. It felt like the next logical step. By 2012, they had expanded into Germany, Switzerland, and Liechtenstein. For a moment, it seemed like they had cracked the code, until they had not.
Domino's has reportedly closed its last branch.
They shut down all of its locations in Italy
after it failed to win over Italians with its mass-produced pizzas.
Domino's Pizza is to close down all its stores in Italy.
In 2015, Domino's entered Italy, the birthplace of pizza, with its European playbook, making pizzas as fast as possible and delivering them to people's doorsteps. But in Italy, pizza was not just another meal. It was culture, something crafted with care and eaten straight from the oven. Domino's, of course, ignored this. After all, its European strategy was working elsewhere on the continent, so why would not it work here? Just 7 years later, the company collapsed, filed for bankruptcy, and shut down all 29 locations across the country, a fraction of the nearly 800 it had once projected. This One Europe strategy is not unique to Domino's either. In the 1980s, Coors, the American beer company, successfully expanded to the UK with its Turn It Loose advertising campaign. British consumers loved it, so the company scaled the campaign to Spain. But when it launched, Turn It Loose was immediately interpreted as a common Spanish phrase meaning suffering from diarrhea. And just like that, the brand image was destroyed. Time and time again, American companies have failed in Europe because they underestimate the time, money, and commitment required to succeed there. They treat Europe like the US, a collection of similar markets with minor variations. But in reality, Europe is far too diverse for that logic to work. In other words, a product that sells well, or a marketing campaign that resonates in one European country, will not necessarily work in another, even if they share a border. Many American companies have struggled to adapt to this, and even when they recognize the problem, they often choose to ignore it because building country-specific strategies is expensive, slow, and difficult to scale. But Europe has not responded to this resistance with indifference. As American companies try to force their methods into European markets, Europe pushes back. And in 2024 alone, that pushback cost American companies more than $7 billion. American companies dominate globally but fail in Europe, and it is not just because of cultural misunderstandings or bad strategies. It is that their entire business models are built around a version of capitalism that simply does not exist there. In the US, capitalism has always been straightforward. For the most part, government stays out of the way, creating an environment where companies can take bigger risks, expand more aggressively, and extract the maximum possible profit, even if that sometimes means bending ethical lines. In Europe, however, things are different. Capitalism still exists, but government steps in to balance growth with other priorities like worker protections, consumer rights, fair competition, and environmental standards. And even though the level of regulation in Europe has recently come under scrutiny for American companies, it creates massive problems. In 1997, when Walmart entered Germany, it did exactly what had made it successful in the US. It leveraged relationships with manufacturers, secured massive bulk discounts, and offered customers the lowest prices on the market. In less than a month, it received an official letter from the German government: raise your prices or face penalties. You see, instead of trying to compete, German retailers simply reported Walmart to the authorities for selling products below cost. Walmart executives who had built their entire business on offering the lowest prices were left confused. To them, this was just competition. But in Germany, it was a violation of fair competition laws. Complying did not mean tweaking a few policies. It meant stripping away the very thing that made Walmart its aggressive pricing. After 9 years of struggling, it sold off all its stores and exited with nearly $1 billion in losses. For decades, American companies have built their business models without strict regulations dictating what they can and cannot do. This has led to a situation where, when those regulations are introduced, their entire business model falls apart. With labor laws that protect employees, Amazon cannot cycle through workers the way it does in the US to maintain a constantly motivated workforce. With privacy laws that protect people's data, Meta cannot bombard Europeans with targeted ads, its main revenue source. And with competition laws that protect smaller businesses, Walmart cannot operate with the same efficiency in Europe. It is not just that these regulations exist, it is that they are actually enforced, something American companies are far less accustomed to. In 2023 alone, Meta was fined over $1 billion for violating privacy laws, Apple $500 million for anti-competitive practices, and Intel over $400 million for abusing its market position. In fact, Alphabet, Google's parent company, has been fined so many times by the EU that it now has a dedicated section for these fines in its balance sheet. In the US, however, companies rarely face serious punishment for such issues. No fines, no breakups, no real consequences. While American capitalism rewards whoever can grow the fastest, European capitalism balances growth with social welfare. And while this means European companies are often less dominant than their American counterparts, that has always been the plan. It is about confronting the fact that their entire business model, the strategies, the tactics, and the competitive advantages that made them successful were designed for a version of capitalism that simply does not exist in Europe. Adapting would require becoming a fundamentally different company, which, for most of them, just is not feasible. For decades, American companies have thrived on a simple formula: find what works and scale it, no matter the cost. But in Europe, things have always operated on a different logic, one where cultural nuances matter, where stability is valued over disruption, and where regulations exist not to slow down businesses, but to protect the people those businesses serve. So for American companies to succeed in Europe, they must be willing to put in the work, because at the end of the day, Europe is not a single market waiting to be conquered. It is a dozen different markets, each with its own language, culture, and way of doing business. And until American companies truly accept that, they will keep making the same billion-dollar mistakes for years to come.